There you are now. Welcome back to the workshop. So on today's episode, I'm going to take you with me on a little job I have to do. This is a rapid turnaround job. The car is going away the weekend for a journey on the Aran Islands, and right at the last minute we noticed a problem with the brakes, and I want to just get this sorted for the customer real quick and get him back out and on his road and enjoying his holiday. So the problem that this car has is there's a wobble and a judder in the brakes. He dry stores this car in the winter time, and we've been doing little bits and pieces on it over the years, and one of the things that has cropped up once or twice for me when I've been assessing the car is that the brakes were getting tired. Now they've always worked really very well, but this judder has kind of grown and grown. It can come from when cars are lying up over the winter and a surface rust builds up on the disc. Wherever the pad is sitting tends to have less surface rust than other parts of the disc. The result in this is that when the car gets taken out for its first or second drive and you press your foot on the brakes, you can get it'll take the surface rust off of the areas where the pad wasn't sitting, but there won't be rust, or there'll be very little rust where the pad was sitting, and you get this kind of difference in the disc. You can sometimes skim that out of a disc, but these discs are really old. They have a lot of mileage on them, and cast iron has this funny effect whereby when it goes through heat cycles, which obviously that's exactly what brakes are, they turn your forward momentum into heat. This heat cycling, warming and cooling, warming and cooling, warming and cooling, hardens the cast iron, especially on the surface, and it gets this real brittle, hard surface. Skimming discs like that, I've had very little success in the past with doing that, especially these smaller type discs, because what tends to happen is, unless you have an incredibly rigid setup in your lathe and a very, very sharp cutter, what can happen is the cutter can actually follow the indifference in the disc, because when you skim a disc, you're only actually taking a very small amount off. Now, is that to say that you can't successfully skim a disc? You absolutely can, and there is plenty of machine shops out there that do it. They normally do it with a very sophisticated diamond cutter on a really rigid setup. The price of mini brake discs, it just doesn't make it worthwhile to really get set up to skim discs nowadays. It's just actually easier and much more cost effective to just replace the disc and put a fresh disc on. As I said, these have gone through a lot of heat cycles, they're old now, and they're well due replacing anyway. So I thought I'd just bring you along on the process, just so you can see the couple of different steps that you need to follow, and a couple of different places where some little pitfall comes. This car is running Cooper S discs with a 4-pot alloy caliper. Okay, so that's the particular setup it has. It works very well. They fit under the 10-inch wheels that this car runs. It's a sort of a mini light, and these aluminium calipers allow the customer to run them. It's 7.5 Cooper S disc brake system, just upgraded from the original twin pot AP caliper to a sort of an aluminium. I actually don't know who the brand is. I wouldn't have a problem telling you, but they're kind of unbranded, or they were branded and it's worn off or it has gone away. They look to me like the mini sport caliper, but I couldn't say for certain. I'll give you a better look at them when we get at it. I've already jacked the car up. You've seen me jack enough cars up at this stage that you don't need to see this one getting jacked up. Very interesting question came actually on the last video when we were working on the race car. A couple of people commented on the fact that I jacked the race car up on the sump of the gearbox. Now I've answered it in the comments, but I said I'd give it a shout on today's video because it is actually worth talking about. The engine mounts that are on the race car, they're not solid. They are actually just brand new or very fresh standard engine mounts. But I do a modification to the engine mount where I weld on a little piece of extra steel. What that piece of steel actually does is it acts as a stopper. So when you jack the engine, well, you jack the car from the gearbox, what people were worried about happening is that you'll tear the engine mounts out of the subframe, and they were quite right about that. I came across this in the past, but a really quick place to jack a Mini during a race weekend to quickly get the wheels on or off, or to do a modification to the car, is the sump. It's readily available, it's a lovely solid flat surface, and it's a really easy place to jack a Mini. The sump is more than strong enough to take the jacking, but like the people were saying in the comments, the engine mountings necessarily aren't. I do a modification to the engine mounts when I get them. I weld on a little piece of angle, and basically what that does is when the engine jacks up, it does move in the rubber mount first, but then it hits this piece of metal plate and then brings the whole car up with it. So it kind of becomes a solid mount when the weight of the engine is taken off of it. It probably only moves 2 or 3 millimeters before it hits that solid plate. For a race car, you only need very little movement in the engine mounting anyway. It's just enough to allow the engine get aligned in the subframe, and then all the engine stabilizers go on and the engine is effectively solid mounted then anyway. But these little stoppers just allow me to very quickly get a jack in underneath the race car and jack it off the sump. So just to give you an idea, that's what that is. And definitely, if you don't have that type of modified engine mount, don't jack your Mini off the sump, especially if you've got a kind of a standard road going Mini or even a modified road going Mini that hasn't got either solid mounts or a mount like that where it's modified, because otherwise when you're jacking your Mini up, you will tear your engine mounts, or you'll certainly damage them, and you can bend the gear linkage, you can dislodge the exhaust, you can do untold kind of damage. So very definitely that's the story with the race car. So hopefully that will clear that up. So first job to do is to get the wheel off. Now this wheel is fitted with locking wheel nuts, and this is kind of one of the very first places that I want to kind of just point something out, right? Never use one of these air guns on those locking wheel nuts. And it's not that the locking wheel nut can't handle it, it tends to be the cheap socket that they give you with them. Now when I say cheap socket, I'm not degrading the quality of the lock and wheel nut. The lock and wheel nuts are normally all pretty good quality, but these sockets, they just don't tend to be made of really good material, and if you use the air gun, pretty quickly the socket rounds over on the end and you just can't get that wheel nut off. And generally they make these lock and wheel nuts out of really hard steel because they don't want them to get tampered with. So in an effort to try and you know, evade somebody drilling out the wheel nut or drilling off the wheel nut, they make them out of real hard steel. So if you damage your lock and wheel nut, you can probably modify a socket or something, but it's just better to avoid that, and the easiest way to avoid it is just use a wrench. I only ever torque those lock and wheel nuts up to about 20 foot-pounds as well. I don't torque them to the usual torque that a normal wheel nut is. 20 will be more than enough to hold it on there with the other 3 in place, and it'll keep the lock and wheel nut in place. But it's for that reason I generally don't tend to like lock and wheel nuts, and I think actually the customer said he's going to get them off this car and replace them with standard wheel nuts. For the other nuts, you can happily use your air gun to pop the wheel off, no problems whatsoever. 11/16 socket, a lot of people get caught in that one as well. I know this is just simple stuff today, but they're just stuff to point out. Minis aren't on 17mm. They use a 7/16 for their wheel nuts, or sorry, 11/16 for their wheel nuts, not 17. All right, because 11/16 is the correct fit on them. Pop your wheel off. If you're, you know, if you're jacking up cars, lads, I always take the liberty of putting the wheel underneath the car like that. This car is properly set up on axle stands, but it's still a good idea to put the wheel underneath it, and it just means if the car ever does fall, the axle stands goes, whatever, you have something between the ground and the car. You know, sacrifice a wheel over your hands, your feet, or whatever it is. The next thing to do is to get the brake caliper off. Okay, with the wheel off, next to take off is the brake caliper. The brake caliper is held on with 2 bolts. I'll have something to say about that when it comes to putting the caliper back on. So on these setup, what you'll see here is that these are these aluminium 4-pot calipers with, it has the green stuff brake calipers. They're pretty decent, to be honest with you, or great. Did you hear me? Green stuff brake calipers. Green stuff brake pads is what I'm saying. They are quite good. I'm not a huge fan of them, but in certain circumstances they can be good. I kind of prefer the Mintex variety of those road going or fast road going pads, but look, everybody has their own flavour of brake pads. These, to be honest with you, actually perform pretty well. If it wasn't for these brakes having a wobble in them, the performance of the brakes is actually really quite good. these 4-pot calipers are a good upgrade from the original Cooper S 2-piston caliper. But with that said, the original Cooper S 2-piston caliper with the right brake pads can actually be a phenomenal brakes. The green Cooper S race car that you've seen us use, or you've seen me put the engine in recently, that has carbon Lorraine brake pads on original Cooper S pads, and they're phenomenal. The brakes in that car are absolutely amazing. The sacrifice, unfortunately, is the pads are very hard on the discs, and because they're carbon metallic, the dust off them is highly corrosive and absolutely will dismantle your wheels. Okay, just before I take that caliper off, I just want to grab a cable tie, and I get this cable tie just simply to hold this caliper while we're doing the job. You don't want to leave calipers hanging by the brake hose because it damages the brake hose. So sacrifice a cable tie and put one in there. I used to always have a little piece of wire to hold up these brake pads or brake calipers that used to hang off the shock, but I lost it. And do you know, it's something I might remake because it would be a bit more environmentally friendly than using cable ties all the time. So these calipers have a bolt and spacer. That spacer goes on the inside and it sets the clearance for the disc and pad. So a little bit of a faff to put them on and off, to be honest with you, because of that, but that's the design and that's the way they are. Next to come off is the CV joint nut. Okay, next thing to do is to take out this CV joint. Now you can see that I have already replaced this nut a while ago. This car got brake discs in the very near past. Don't know if near past is a word, but yeah, you know what I mean. Recently. So the nut was really galled up, the original nut was really galled up, so we replaced it with a new nut. Something that you always have to be really careful with when you're changing these nuts. Some of these CV joints are metric and some are imperial. So some have a UNF thread and some have a metric thread. So just be really careful. If the nut doesn't wind on nicely after a couple of turns, then check to see if you're on UNF or imperial. So air gun makes taking these off real easy. Bingo bango. That gets that one off. Inside there is a spacer washer. It's a taper locking washer. So you need to make sure when you're looking at these taper locking washers, the big danger, and I'm going to show you a damaged one in a bit, is you don't want a groove in there. Okay, that needs to be dead flat. What happens over time is these taper washers run in on the driving flange and they sit in this spot here, and if the CV joint is not done up tight, it rocks like this as you're driving and it wears a groove into the taper here. You get a groove worn in here, and what the problem with that is that when you're torquing your CV locking nut here, rather than this compressing and pulling in nicely, it'll compress, sit on the groove and lock up there, and you'll get a torque reading that isn't correct. You'll drive it down the road and the weeble wobbling of this going down the road will reset this taper washer, and you'll lose the torque off the nut and your wheel bearing will fail in short order. So let's bring this around to the bench and change out the disc. So we have the Cooper S disc off, and the Cooper S disc is made up of two components. It's made up of the disc and a built-in disc hub and a driving flange which bolts to the disc hub. There's one or two little intricacies about this driving flange I want to show you, but first let's get it off and then we'll give it a bit of a clean. So somebody has been in here before, this wasn't me. They've used a couple of different screws. Now it's not a problem, other than it looks a bit funky. It's perfectly functional. You know, they should be these Phillips crosshead screws. That's what it should be. But somebody has, obviously one was broken, sheared or lost, and they just replaced it with a slot head. It's no problem. It's perfectly functional. So with those screws out, people often wonder, are these screws holding the whole affair together? They're not. They just literally hold the disc to the driving flange when you don't have the wheel nuts on. So it just stops the whole thing from falling apart when you don't have the wheel nuts on. Once you have the wheel nuts on, the wheel nuts clamp the disc to the driving flange. So the structure is made up of actually the torque of the wheel nuts. These little beveled screws are literally just centralizers. They just hold the whole thing together when the wheel nuts are not on. So that's the disc in its entirety. It has obviously got its 4 wheel studs. It's a piece of cast that's all machined. You can see why this is a bit of a divil to have to work in a lathe, because of the very fact, and you can see where that chattering was taking place here on the disc. So you can see why that's going to be a bit of a pain to get in the lathe. And as I said, the material is very hard at this stage. Like if I ran a file over this, you would hear the file skeeting off of it because it has gone hard and brittle from all the work. So before we put the new disc on, I just want to quickly clean off the grease and crud that is going to be on this driving flange. So we'll just open up our safety clean here and just quickly give this a bit of a scrub. Is it strictly necessary that we do that? Not strictly necessary, but well, 2 things. One, it's nice to be working with something that's clean, and secondly, you don't want to be introducing any contaminants to the new disc. So it is a good idea that we give it a bit of a clean off and just make sure all the surfaces are in good order. It'll help us. We have a bit of inspection to do here, and it will help us with that inspection if we can have this clean, and we can see if there's any mismatches going on or if there's any problems that we need to take care of. So that's why it's handy to have a cleaning tank like this just at our disposal, ready to rock and roll when we need it. Just take this moment just to thank everybody who is a subscriber to the channel. I really do appreciate everybody, all your comments. I've managed to catch up on the comments, so hopefully you guys will keep chatting away with me, keep sending me the comments. Sorry lads, at the moment with the changes with COVID and stuff, I'm back to my day job teaching. So between teaching, trying to keep all these minis on the road, trying to go racing, I am a busy boy, so my apologies when I'm a little bit slow on the comments. I am trying my best to keep up with them. Lunch breaks are the place for those to get done. Everybody who is new to the channel, you are most welcome. Thank you for coming along. Thanks for clicking on that video and giving it a look and coming and hanging out here in the shop with me. Have a look at some of our other videos, and if you enjoy those videos, click that subscribe button and join our little community here where we hang out in the workshop and we get some cars fixed. We have a look at our Land Rovers and we go racing as well. So thank you very much for that. Everybody else who's watching, please give us that old thumbs up, that like. It really does help. It helps get broaden the knowledge of our channel on YouTube, and it helps boost us up in the old algorithm. Comments down below, love hearing your comments and love chatting about them. Another very good comment actually that came in, and I was just reading it there today, and I would like to just touch on it here on air. Somebody was asking me about the aerodynamic qualities of a round nose mini versus a Clubman, and it's very interesting. I don't think it has actually ever been tested in a wind tunnel and proven or disproven, but I do remember the legendary racer Nick Swift talking about the Padmore 1275 GT versus his Willow racing car, and I remember him saying that at one point in time they had engine horsepower that was very similar, but they had slightly higher top speed, if I remember correctly, on the round nose, and I think they attributed that to aerodynamics, or to the lack of aerodynamics on the Clubman. Minis in general start falling asunder aerodynamically at around 100 mile an hour. That's not to say they won't go past 100, and they do go past 100 no problems whatsoever, but they aerodynamically start to fall asunder around that speed, and you start to have massive increases in horsepower to get very small speed increases. I don't fully understand the physics of it, but you know, it's something to do with reaching some sort of terminal point where the horsepower required to go further is going to massively increase. Okay, back to the brakes. So a couple of things I want to show you on the brakes here. Some of the places that we have to be very careful with, this back surface here, this is the surface that is going to connect the driving flange to the disc, and it needs to be perfectly flat. So what we need to check it for is any raised areas or any lumps or hollows missing out of it. This one looks really good, it's nice and flat, and it has a good surface. Another area we have to be very careful of is this back portion here, this part of the back of the driving flange. This will abut with the inner race of the bearing. Now, what you can see on this one is we have a nice flat spot here, but we have an indentation here and a ridge here. Measuring the bearing race, this flat spot is absolutely perfect. It's exactly sitting on the bearing race, but this ridge here is also going to sit on it. So before I connect this driving flange back onto the disc, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly deburr this with the die grinder to get all that burr off of there, so that we know when this goes back in and sits on the wheel bearing, it will sit nice and flat on it. Okay, so we have our brand new disc here, which these thankfully come with new wheel studs as well. Originally when you got these back in the day, they didn't come with wheel studs. You had to bang out the old wheel studs and put them into your drum, and yeah, that was a bit of a challenge. But nowadays they come with the wheel studs, so that's great. Makes life for us just a little bit easier. So the driving flange is going to sit on here, and we're going to be lining up the 4 holes of the driving flange with the 4 grub screws that we've seen before. Now, some people I've seen over the years put a bit of bearing retaining compound on the back here and onto the disc. I'm not a big fan of that, because what can happen, well, one, the surface finish isn't good enough on either the disc or on the driving flange for that really to be very successful. But with that said, I'm not a big fan of it, because I find it can cause or can introduce the potential for some misalignment. So I would omit that. It wouldn't be something that I put on. It wasn't done in the factory, so and that worked just perfectly fine for years, so no real need for us to be doing it. I, however, will recommend that you clean the threads of the screws really carefully with a wire wheel, and use a little bit of Loctite when you're putting these screws in, just to help them stay in there and not come loose. I have seen in the past these screws come loose and stand up, and when you put the wheel on, depending on the configuration of the inside of your wheel, the wheel can sit up on the screw, and it introduces a wobble into the wheel, which can be a problem. So I'm going to clean these up on the wire wheel, then we'll give them a little dab of Loctite, and we'll be where we need to be. So just a small dab of Loctite on them. The one I'm using here is actually bearing fit, is what this is. But the nice thing about the bearing fit is that when you give this a bit of heat, so if the fella comes after me and wants to, you know, replace this disc and it's not me, all he has to do is apply the blowtorch to this, get it up to sort of 250 or 300 degrees, and that Loctite will let go completely, and he'll be able to release those screws really easily. I just want to mention, in the last video I did say that I was going to be bringing you on today's video some footage from the racetrack. Unfortunately, we got some bad news during the week, and that was when we submitted our race entry, we were told very strictly and very categorically that we were only going to be allowed the driver and the mechanic. So the driver being Neil and me being the mechanic are the only two people that are going to be allowed at the track. And as much as I'd like to pretend that it's me who shoots all these videos and I am brilliant behind the camera, I am not. In fact, I am brutal behind the camera. So our great cameraman Billy won't be able to come to the track with us. So what we're going to try and do over the weekend is we're going to try and do some in-car, I'm going to try and shoot some in-car footage with the GoPro, and I'm also going to try and do a little bit of footage with the camera myself as I go around. Unfortunately, I'll be quite busy over the weekend, so the chances of me getting a lot of content won't be brilliant, but I'll get as much as I can. We've been assured, however, that hopefully by the next race weekend, which is going to be in July, Ireland will be in a different stage of COVID and we are going to be allowed to bring more than just the race driver and the mechanic. So that'll be the weekend that, fingers crossed, we're going to start getting you some footage on the track. I really am sorry about that, guys. I know I mentioned during the week, and that's me just putting my big foot in it. I didn't even think for a second that the track would have restrictions like that for COVID, but sure, look, they're the times we're in at the moment, and that's the way it is. So my apologies, but we are going to try and get you some footage. Hopefully maybe Wednesday that'll air, and there will be some track footage, even if it's just a bit of in-car about the, you know, so you can hear the GT at full chat, or, you know, something like that. I'll do my best to get you some footage, but it is what it is going to be, unfortunately. So my apologies for that. I know I did say I was going to bring you on track, and I did have everything set up for that. We even got new microphones so that we could record better sound of the cars, but hey, look, that's the way it is. How tight should we put these? The way I like to tighten these, there is a thing you can get called an impact driver. I see a lot of people on YouTube channels with those. You give them a bang, they have a Torx bit in them and they screw them. What I find is if you put these on with those, they're near impossible to get off. And the torque figure for them from the factory is something like 6 pounds or 6.5, I think even inch pounds. I don't even think it's foot pounds, so it's very little. What I find is the best way to do this is real simple, right? With a screwdriver that you're not too fond of, this is just cheapies from Aldi or Lidl that I use for this, bring a bit of torque on it and give it 1 or 2 shocks. That's all it needs, just 1 or 2 bangs. So just bring up a little bit of torque on it and give it 1 or 2. That's literally all it needs to be. It's just enough to settle the taper on the screw and settle the screw into where it needs to go. And that's it, guys. That is more than tight enough. It's perfectly fine and ready to fit. So let's get this disc back on the car. So like I said, just be really careful with this taper washer that there isn't any groove in it, because that is going to cause problems with that seating in there. Now the torque on these, this is what they call twin split pin holes. So there's one that way and one that way. And the torque on these is like 190 Newton meters, or I think it's 190 to 200 Newton meters, which is absolutely astronomical. The way that I get that torque with these is by using this lockup bar. So I made this years ago, and it's just, it picks up on 2 of the studs. You just tighten on the wheel studs and the bar then locks down against the ground. And what that allows you then to do is to get the socket onto there and get the torque specification on the nut. Other ways that you can do it is you can put the brake caliper back on and get somebody with big muscles to stamp on the brakes and hold the disc while you torque the nut. But it can slip, and I'm a one-man band in the shop here, and I need to be able to do this stuff without getting anybody else involved. So this is the methodology I came up with. It's not nothing fancy, a bit of tube, bit of flat plate, and 2 holes at the right distance apart. I've seen a few people that carve it out here to give yourself more room for the socket and stuff, but this has always just worked fine for me, so that's what I've done. Get this torqued and then we will put the caliper back on. So the split pin we took out is well and truly past its used by date, so it's time to replace it. There's 2 different types of split pin used on these front brake calipers, or sorry, these front disc hubs. You can get this one quite often, and this is wrong, okay? See the way that split pin falls around inside there? That is the wrong size split pin. It comes in some of the kits, and I just shown it to you to be careful. The right size split pin is this one here, and you'll see how the fit in there is right, okay? How do you fit a split pin? I know this is teaching people how to suck eggs, but the right way to fit a split pin is like that. okay? The split pin goes in with the eye across the nut. You bend up the longest leg of the split pin, comes up towards the CV like that, comes up over the outside, and then this bottom leg just gets bent back in there. I normally just shorten them up a little bit so they don't foul on the center of the wheel, and then just give them a bend back in the way. That's literally all it needs to be, okay? So that stops the CV, the split pin from coming out. This one is acting as a lock on the bottom, and this one is acting as the lock on the top to stop that nut from being able to back off, okay? The split pin should move, it shouldn't be tight in the hole. If it is tight in the hole, you need to turn on your nut slightly more or turn your nut back off. So oftentimes people ask me, well, I've come up to torque, but there's no hole showing. What do I do? You need to keep tightening the nut until such a point as the next hole opens up, okay? In these 4 hole where they've got the 2 cross holes, that's going to be every quarter of a turn. Whereas if you've got just the single pin, it's going to be every castellation, okay? So these are better, these CV joints with the 4 holes through them are better for getting closer to the right torque. But the good quality taper roller bearing with the proper spacer in the middle, to be honest with you, you could go anything between 180 Newton meters and 220 or 30. The nut will hold about 230 before it'll start to get to yield, so it'll be perfectly fine up to that. So that's where it is. Next thing is put the caliper back on and then the wheel, and this job is OXO. Just before I put the caliper on, I'm just going to hit the disc with a little bit of brake cleaner. It's important to use brake cleaner and not any other kind of solvent. You need this solvent to flash off quickly so it takes any oils or greases off the disc and doesn't contaminate the pad. So all those fingerprints from me and my grubby hands touching the disc, they need to be gone, so as that we make sure that we don't contaminate our disc when the brake pads, or sorry, we don't contaminate the brake pads, Paul, not the disc. Okay, so just make sure that that's all nice and clean. You can see those kind of, you can see the muck and dirt coming off there. So that's what we want. What I then do is just with another nice clean part of the lint-free cloth, just do that. Don't use a rag, lads, use paper, because the rag soaks up all kinds of oils and greases and we just transfer them back to the disc. So they go on there. Now, when you fit new discs like this, oftentimes you're going to have to push back out your brake pads because they're not going to fit on there. On something like this, where the brake pads are nice and fresh, you'll be able to just push them out by hand real easy with just something like a nice big flat blade screwdriver. If the caliper is not a good quality, or sorry, if it's an old, well-used caliper, you might need to very carefully clean the pistons before you put them on, because you're going to find yourself in a situation where grit and dirt will have got in behind the pad and against the piston, and if you just shove the pad back without cleaning the pistons, you're going to ingress all that dirt into the wiper seal of the brake caliper. In the case of this caliper, I know that I'm only moving them back the slightest little bit, so it's perfectly fine just to give them just a small wedge with the screwdriver just to open them up ever so slightly so the caliper will fit on. Now, before I put in these brake caliper bolts, I just gave them a quick run on the wire wheel just to clean off any oil, dirt or grease or old Loctite that was on them. When we fit them, we're going to give it a dab of Loctite again, same as before, just a small dab. Anytime you're working with bolts and brakes, it's a good idea just to give them that little dab of Loctite. It's a bit of peace of mind. People often say to me, oh Paul, it'll make taking it apart a nightmare. No, it doesn't. A little bit of heat, I think you only have to get this one up to like 250 degrees and it'll break the Loctite and it'll open off fine. So we'll get these caliper bolts in and then we are ready to wrap this little job up. Last little tip here, guys. Always torque caliper bolts. They're a stress member of the car. They hold the brakes on. If your brakes fails, you end up in a whole world of hurt. So always torque them. If you're trying to figure out what torque specifications you need, Cole over at Classic Mini DIY has a great website with all of the torque specifications, free to air, no charge to you. Just pop on his website and you'll get to see those torque specs there. So you know, support Cole in offering that information and head over there. The torque is 50 Newton meters. Always come smoothly up to the torque. If you don't make the torque in one smooth move, back the bolt off and then come up to the torque again. If you run out of turn with the torque wrench is what I mean. So if you're coming up the torque and you run out of play, back off the bolt, reposition your torque wrench and come up to it in one smooth movement. You're trying to get rid of inertial friction. Okay, hope you enjoyed coming along with me for this short little video on getting the brake discs done. That's all I have to do on this video and all I have to say in this video. I'll see you guys on the next one.